The morning fog over northern France was thick enough to taste, wet, heavy, and clinging to every leaf and helmet. It was August 1944, and the countryside near Mortain had become a graveyard for machines. Burned-out Shermans and Panthers lay twisted across the hedgerows, silent reminders of the chaos that had engulfed both armies. Inside one of the few remaining American tanks, a battered M4 Sherman nicknamed Dixie, Lieutenant Jack Rawlins stared at his map. His crew waited for orders, their nerves stretched thin after days of retreat and ambushes. The Germans had launched a counterattack with terrifying precision, slicing through the 30th Infantry Division and threatening to cut off the Allied advance toward Paris. But Rawlins wasn't the type to retreat. He'd been a mechanic before. The war, a man who thought in angles, gears, and split-second chances. Now in the mud and smoke of Normandy, that instinct was all he had left. Through the periscope he saw it. A German convoy, fuel trucks, half-tracks, and Panthers moving through the valley below. A perfect target, if only they weren't outnumbered 10-1. His plan was unorthodox, insane even, but in war desperation makes geniuses out of madmen. When Rawlins shared his idea over the radio, other commanders laughed. "Your last 30 seconds," one said. But as his engine roared to life, and the fog swallowed his Sherman whole, the laughter faded into static. Within the hour, the field below would erupt in fire, a one-tank ambush that would enter the history books not for its strategy, but for its sheer audacity. This is the story of the Sherman crew that defied orders, defied logic, and turned an impossible plan into victory. August 1944. The fields of Normandy were still littered with wrecks from the Great Breakout, and yet the war refused to die down. The Germans were fighting with a kind of desperation that made them unpredictable, dangerous, and relentless. The Allies had pushed deep into occupied France after D-Day, but Hitler had ordered one final fanatical counterattack. It would be called Operation Lüttich, a last-ditch effort to drive the Americans back to the beaches and split the Allied front in two. It was madness even by his standards, but for the men on the ground madness was all that was left. The town of Mortain became the epicenter of that storm. Thick fog blanketed the hills, muffling the rumble of engines and the thud of artillery. It was supposed to give the Germans cover for their surprise assault, but it also trapped everyone in a maze of smoke and confusion. American tank crews couldn't see more than 20 yards ahead. Infantrymen stumbled through hedgerows blind to where the enemy was. The Germans, experienced in ambush tactics, used that to their advantage. The battlefield became a brutal guessing game, and death favored those who moved first. Lieutenant Jack Rawlins sat in the commander's seat of his Sherman tank, nicknamed Dixie. The paint was chipped, the treads were caked with mud, and the hull was dented from near misses that had scared them more times than they could count. Inside, the air reeked of oil, sweat, and cordite. His crew was exhausted. 3 days of constant movement, little food, and barely any sleep. The fog outside pressed against the vision slits like a ghostly wall. The radio crackled, but the messages were fragmented, half swallowed by interference. Somewhere out there, German tanks were moving, and they were closing in. For the first time in days, there was silence. The kind of silence that screamed louder than any artillery barrage. Rawlins peered through his periscope, scanning the grey landscape. Through breaks in the mist, he saw the aftermath of battle. Burning vehicles, the smouldering carcass of a destroyed half-track, and a field littered with twisted metal. But then something caught his eye. Movement. Not random, but organized. Shadows. Long, dark, and mechanical, creeping along a narrow valley road. He adjusted the focus. What he saw made his stomach tighten. It was a German convoy. Dozens of vehicles stretching into the fog. Panthers, half-tracks, and most importantly, fuel trucks. Tankers filled with gasoline. The lifeblood of any armored division. If that convoy reached the front, the German offensive would have the fuel it needed to keep driving west. If it didn't, the attack would sputter out. Rawlins knew what that meant. He was looking at the key to stopping the entire counter-offensive, but there was a problem. His tank was alone. Every other Sherman in his platoon had been knocked out over the past 2 days. Reinforcements were scattered. The air support that normally gave the Americans the upper hand was grounded by fog. There would be no bombers overhead, no artillery raining down to soften the target. Just him, 4 men, and a machine that was outclassed in almost every technical way. "Jack, we're down to half our ammo," his gunner, Tex Hammond, said quietly, breaking the silence. "And if we get spotted, those Panthers'll cook us before we get a shot off." Rawlins didn't answer right away. He kept watching the convoy. The German column moved slowly, cautiously, unaware that an American tank sat just over the ridge. He could see officers walking alongside the vehicles, shouting orders. The entire road was lined with targets, fuel, munitions, and men. It was an irresistible opportunity, and a death trap at the same time. Eddie Morales, the loader, leaned forward. "We could radio for support," he suggested, though they all knew it was hopeless. The radio had been failing for hours. Static filled the channel. They were effectively cut off. Rawlins finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "No support's coming," he said. "If that fuel gets to their front, our boys in Mortain are finished." He looked at each man in turn, Tex, Morales, and Ray Daniels, the driver. "So we hit those tankers, we stopped the whole damn counterattack." Tex frowned. "You're talking about taking on an entire convoy with one tank." Rawlins gave a small grin. "No, I'm talking about taking it by surprise." Outside, the fog shifted, revealing a sliver of the valley below. The German convoy crawled through like a steel serpent, engines growling, exhaust spilling into the mist. The sound echoed faintly up the hillside. Rawlins could almost feel it through the ground, the rhythm of gears, the heartbeat of an army still trying to win a war it had already lost. He knew the risks. The Sherman's armor was thin, and its gun was no match for the front plating of a Panther. But what he lacked in firepower, he could make up for in ingenuity. If he could hit the fuel trucks first, the resulting explosion might ignite the rest of the convoy. It would be chaos, and chaos was his only ally now. "Daniels, get us into position behind that hedgerow," Rawlins ordered. The driver didn't hesitate. The tank's engine growled as it crept forward, treads biting into the damp soil. They moved like ghosts, the fog cloaking their motion. Every branch that snapped, every rock that shifted beneath the treads felt deafeningly loud. Finally, they stopped. The convoy was directly below them now, barely 200 yards away. The perfect vantage point, and the perfect shot. Tex loaded a high-explosive shell. "Ready when you are, Lieutenant." Rawlins took one last look through the sight. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. "Hold your fire," he whispered. Timing would be everything. Down below, the first of the fuel trucks came into view, its cylindrical body gleaming faintly through the mist. Behind it, another and another, dozens of them. He could see German soldiers walking casually beside the trucks, rifles slung, unaware that death was staring at them from the ridge above. "Now," Rawlins said. The gun thundered. The recoil slammed through the tank's frame. A split second later, the shell struck the lead truck square in the middle. The explosion was cataclysmic, a blinding flash followed by a shockwave that shook the ground. Fire erupted in every direction. Through the periscope, Rawlins saw German soldiers thrown off their feet, vehicles scattering in panic. Tex reloaded. The next shot hit another tanker. More explosions followed, rolling down the road like a chain of fiery dominoes. The convoy was in chaos, and that was only the beginning. The explosion lit up the valley like a second sunrise, orange and violent. Flames leapt high into the fog, devouring everything they touched. The air rippled with heat, and a deep rolling thunder echoed across the ridgeline. German soldiers scrambled in confusion, shouting orders that were lost in the roar of burning fuel. Trucks jackknifed on the narrow road. Half-tracks veered into ditches, and a Panther tank at the rear fired blindly into the mist, unsure of where the attack was coming from. Inside the Sherman, Rawlins's crew could barely hear each other over the chaos. The hull trembled as debris rained down around them. Tex was already reloading, sweat dripping into his eyes. "We've got their attention now," he yelled. "Good," Rawlins replied, his tone steady but his pulse racing. "Let's keep it that way." He peered through the periscope. The fog that had once concealed them now reflected the fire below, glowing red like a living inferno. He could see shapes moving, German soldiers trying to unhook artillery pieces, others attempting to turn their armored cars around. The entire road was choked with fire, wreckage, and panic. Rawlins knew he had only seconds before the Germans figured out his position. Tex, next round, high explosive. Aim for the rear fuel truck. On it. Tex slammed the shell into the breach. The tank shook again as the 75mm gun fired. The shell arced into the distance and hit dead center. Another eruption followed, sending black smoke rolling across the valley floor. From below came the clatter of return fire, machine guns spitting bullets into the trees. Most rounds whizzed harmlessly into the foliage, but a few ricocheted off the Sherman's armor with sharp metallic pings. Daniels cursed under his breath. "They're zeroing in on us, Lieutenant." "Then let's make them shoot blind," Rawlins said. "Back us into the tree line. Fuse the smoke." The tank lurched backward, grinding over roots and broken branches. Through the periscope, Rawlins could see the German Panther slowly turning its turret toward the ridge. Its gun, long and precise, began to swing in their direction. The sight sent a chill through him. One hit from that 75mm QK-42 gun, and Dixie would be nothing but molten metal. Tex, AP round. "Let's give them something to think about," Tex hesitated. "Sir, that thing's front armor will eat our shot for breakfast." "I'm not aiming for the armor," Rawlins replied grimly. "I'm aiming for their nerves." Tex nodded, loaded the armor-piercing round, and fired. The shot hit the Panther's side skirt. No real damage, but enough to make the German crew flinch. The Panther paused, its turret halting mid-turn. Rawlins seized the moment. "Daniels, move us!" "Circle left!" The Sherman's treads clawed at the muddy ground, sliding slightly before gaining traction. They moved along the ridge, the tank weaving through trees like a predator stalking its prey. The Panther fired. Its shell exploded where Dixie had been seconds earlier, showering the woods with dirt and smoke. Inside the tank, Morales was shouting coordinates, his voice hoarse. "They've got infantry moving on our right. About 20 of them." Rawlins squinted through the side slit. Shadows darted between the trees, German troops trying to flank them. "Load canister," he ordered. Tex grabbed the special shell, one packed with hundreds of steel balls designed to shred anything in its path. The Sherman fired, and the woods erupted. The German squad vanished in an instant, torn apart by the blast. The few survivors scattered, diving into ditches or sprinting back down the slope. The crew sat in silence for a moment, stunned by the raw power of what they'd just unleashed. Then Tex let out a laugh, short and sharp. They didn't see that one coming. Rawlins allowed himself a grim smile. "Keep laughing. It means we're still alive." He looked again through the periscope. The valley below was now a graveyard of twisted metal. The fuel trucks were gone, reduced to burning skeletons. Several half-tracks were overturned, and one Panther was trying to push its way through the wreckage, its tracks grinding over bodies and debris. The smell of burning gasoline filled the air, mixed with the acrid stench of gunpowder and death. "Lieutenant," Morales said quietly, "we did it." "The whole convoy's gone." Rawlins shook his head. "Not yet. That Panther's still moving. If it calls in reinforcements, we're done." He studied the enemy tank carefully. The Panther was turning its gun again, searching for them through the haze. Rawlins could almost imagine the German commander inside, sweating, furious, trying to make sense of what had happened. The thought gave him an idea, a crazy one. "Daniels," he said slowly, "get us down there." The driver turned, eyes wide. "Sir, you're not serious." Rawlins didn't blink. "We've got one round of high explosive left. If we get close enough, we can jam it right under their turret." Tex stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "You're talking about charging a Panther with a Sherman. That's suicide." Rawlins met his gaze. "Yeah," he said, "but it'll end this fight." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Morales, the youngest of the crew, took a deep breath and muttered, "Hell, we've made it this far." Tex loaded the last HE shell. "Ready when you are." Rawlins gripped the hatch lever. "Daniels, punch it!" The Sherman roared forward, breaking through the tree line. Firelight flickered across its steel hull as it descended into the valley. The Panther spotted them immediately and swung its gun toward them. Rawlins could hear the whine of the German turret motor as it locked on target. "Faster," he shouted. The Sherman's tread screamed against the mud. The distance closed, 200 yards, then 150. The Panther fired. The shell hit the ground just short, spraying dirt across Dixie's hull. "Hold steady," Rawlins barked. "Tex, on my mark." The Sherman skidded to a halt at less than 100 yards. Rawlins lined up the shot. Now the gun fired. The shell struck the Panther's turret ring, the one weak point where armor met movement. The explosion tore through the tank's upper hull, blowing the commander's hatch open like a lid on a boiling pot. Flames burst from within. The German machine stopped moving. Inside Dixie, the crew exhaled all at once. Rawlins watched through the periscope as black smoke poured from the Panther's wreck. His heart pounded in his ears. The impossible had been done, again, but in the distance, through the fading fog, more engines could be heard. The battle wasn't over yet. He keyed the intercom and said quietly, "Reload. We're not done turning them to ashes." The aftermath of the Panther's destruction left the valley eerily silent. Smoke hung low in the air, curling around the blackened wrecks of trucks and armored cars. The once orderly German convoy had been reduced to twisted heaps of metal and charred rubber. The fire from burning fuel tanks flickered through the fog like ghostly lanterns, lighting up the devastated road below. Inside the Sherman, the crew sat in a stunned quiet, the sound of their own breathing loud in their helmets. Rawlins finally broke the silence. "Status." Tex wiped a hand across his sooty face. "Last shell spent. Turrets running hot but still operable. Tracks are holding," Daniels added. "We took a glancing hit, but nothing critical." Morales, their radio operator, frowned at his headset. "No signal from command. Probably too far out or jammed," Rawlins nodded. He knew what that meant. They were alone, deep behind enemy lines and running on fumes. "Then we move north. Stay off the roads. The Krauts will send scouts once they realize what happened here." The Sherman rumbled back into motion, treads crunching over the debris of what had once been a proud German supply column. Through the periscope, Rawlins saw the bodies, soldiers who had moments ago been shouting orders now lying still in the mud. Some were burned beyond recognition, others twisted where they'd fallen. He didn't feel triumph, only exhaustion. War had a way of turning victory into something hollow. As they climbed the slope on the far side of the valley, the fog thickened again, swallowing the wreckage behind them. Daniels guided the tank through the trees, careful to avoid open ground. Every creak of metal, every hiss of steam seemed too loud. They all knew that German patrols wouldn't take long to arrive. Tex broke the tension with a low whistle. "You think they're still laughing about your crazy plan, Lieutenant?" Rawlins smirked faintly. "If they are, I doubt they've got much air left to laugh with." Even in the tension, a ripple of dark humor passed through the crew, a soldier's instinct to joke when death lurked just outside the armor plating. It wasn't just bravado. It was survival. After half an hour of slow progress, the trees thinned, revealing a ridge overlooking a wide expanse of farmland. Through gaps in the morning mist, Rawlins could see the faint glint of movement to the east, columns of German vehicles heading toward the sound of the battle they had just escaped. "The main force was coming. We need to disappear," Rawlins said. "Find cover." They followed an old farm track that wound between hedgerows and into a grove of tall oaks. There they parked the Sherman beneath the trees, camouflaging it with branches and foliage. The crew dismounted cautiously, stretching stiff limbs and breathing in the damp morning air. For the first time in hours, there was quiet. Rawlins walked a few paces from the tank, scanning the horizon. In the distance, the faint hum of aircraft could be heard. German reconnaissance planes, no doubt hunting for the source of the inferno below. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. The odds of surviving another direct encounter were slim, but retreat wasn't in his nature. Tex joined him, carrying his helmet under one arm. "Hell of a morning," he muttered. "Yeah," Rawlins said softly. "One hell of a morning." They stood in silence for a while, watching the smoke rise in lazy columns from the valley. For a fleeting moment, Rawlins felt almost detached, as if observing someone else's battle from afar. But then he remembered the faces of his crew, the trust in their eyes when he'd told them to charge a Panther head-on. That trust had carried them through, just barely. Morales's voice broke over the quiet. "Lieutenant, you'll want to hear this." Rawlins hurried back to the Sherman. Morales had managed to re-establish a weak radio connection. Through the static came the voice of their battalion HQ. "Repeat. Enemy reinforcements converging near Sector D4. All units to hold positions and disrupt enemy supply routes. Reinforcements are en route." Rawlins looked at the map spread out over the tank's glacis plate. Sector D4 was exactly where they were. Reinforcements weren't close enough to help yet. If they stayed, they'd have to fight again. But if they retreated, the Germans would regain the supply corridor. He clenched his jaw. "Looks like we're not done yet," Daniels groaned. "Sir, with respect, we're low on ammo and fuel." "We can't take another fight," I know, Rollins said. That's why we won't fight them head-on this time. Tex grinned wearily. Another crazy plan? Maybe, Rollins said. But it's the only kind that seems to work for us. They spent the next hour preparing. Tex and Morales scavenged ammunition from abandoned German vehicles nearby, finding a few usable rounds and a couple of machine gun belts. Daniels checked the engine, patching a cracked fuel line with tape and sheer determination. Every man worked with silent efficiency, driven by the knowledge that this could be their last stand. As the afternoon wore on, they heard the rumble of engines again, this time closer, moving along the same valley road. A new German column, likely responding to the earlier explosion. Rollins climbed into the commander's hatch and lifted his binoculars. What he saw made his stomach tighten. At least 6 armored half-tracks, 2 light tanks, and dozens of infantry. He lowered the binoculars. All right, boys. They're coming. Same road, same arrogance. Let's make them regret it. Tex checked the main gun one last time. We've only got 3 shells left, sir. Better make them count. Then we'll make every one of them feel like 100, Rollins said. The Sherman rolled out of its hiding place, slow and deliberate. The engine's rumble blended with the wind, masked by the distant thunder of the approaching convoy. Rollins planned to hit them from the flank again, but this time he had something even bolder in mind. He glanced around at his crew, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the control lights. They were tired, soot-covered, and worn down to their nerves, but they were still there, still ready. Gentlemen, Rollins said quietly. They laughed once. Let's remind them why they shouldn't have. As Dixie crawled toward the edge of the ridge, the men could already see the first German trucks entering the kill zone. Another chance to strike, another chance to survive. The fear was real, but so was the fire in their hearts. The war had stripped everything else from them, but not their resolve. And as Rollins gripped the edge of the hatch and gave the order to fire, the Sherman's gun spoke once more with thunder that echoed through the valley, turning disbelief into ashes all over again. The second ambush left the German response force in ruins. Flames licked the horizon, black smoke spiraling into the grey sky as twisted steel and shattered timber smoldered in the valley. The thunder of the Sherman's main gun had finally gone silent, leaving only the soft ticking of the cooling engine and the groan of metal settling after the fight. Inside the cramped tank, the smell of gunpowder, oil and sweat was suffocating. Yet despite the chaos they'd unleashed, there was no cheering, no laughter, only the dull shock of survival. Rollins wiped grime from his face and exhaled shakily. Ammo check. Tex ran a gloved hand over the storage rack, his expression grim. 2 rounds left. That's it. Machine gun belts are down to half a box. Daniel's voice came from below. Fuel's nearly gone too, sir. Maybe enough to crawl a few miles if we're lucky. Morales adjusted the cracked radio dial, static hissing through the speaker. Command's out again. They probably think we're gone. Rollins leaned back in his seat, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into his bones. For hours now, he'd been running on instinct. No time for fear, no time for doubt. But the reality was setting in. They had struck the enemy hard, maybe harder than any small crew could have hoped. But they were stranded, cut off, and dangerously exposed. Outside, the last embers of fire flickered around the carcasses of half-tracks and troop carriers. German bodies lay scattered along the road, their weapons abandoned mid-stride. The fog that had cloaked the valley earlier had burned away under the heat of destruction, revealing the scale of devastation. It was both victory and tragedy, a testament to courage and to madness. Rollins climbed out of the turret and stood on the hull, scanning the horizon through a pair of scorched binoculars. In the distance he could see faint movement, dark shapes darting between the trees. German survivors, scouts. The reprisal would come soon, and when it did there would be no fog, no surprise, no chance to slip away unseen. He slid back into the turret. We're moving out. North Ridge. We can't stay here, Tex frowned. With what fuel? We're nearly bone dry. Then we'll coast on gravity if we have to, Rollins said flatly. I'm not letting them surround us. The crew didn't argue. They trusted him, because every impossible call he'd made so far had somehow worked. The Sherman groaned as its track started to turn, dragging its scarred hull up the dirt path that wound through the woods. The engine sputtered, coughed, then caught again. Each rotation of the treads felt like a small miracle. They climbed steadily toward the ridge, the terrain growing rougher, the trees denser. Branches scraped the sides of the tank, painting long streaks of sap and bark across its scorched surface. Inside, the men sat in silence, listening to the rhythmic clatter of the track links, a sound both comforting and nerve-wracking. Every few seconds, Tex glanced through his sight, half expecting to see movement behind them. After nearly an hour, they reached a plateau overlooking a vast stretch of open countryside. Fields, forests, and distant roads stretched toward the horizon. From this vantage point, the crew could see the remnants of the German supply routes below. What had once been a steady flow of fuel, food, and ammunition was now chaos. Vehicles scattered, columns broken, soldiers scrambling to reorganize. Rawlins studied the scene with cold focus. "We didn't just hurt them," he muttered. "We crippled them." Morales chuckled dryly. "Think the brass will believe that when we tell them? If we make it back?" "Doesn't matter if they believe it," Rawlins said. "We saw it happen." "That's enough." For a brief, almost peaceful moment, the men allowed themselves to breathe. They shared a canteen, split what rations remained, and tried to shake the ringing from their ears. The sun dipped behind a haze of smoke, painting the sky in dull shades of orange and grey. Then the sound came, a deep, distant rumble. At first, they thought it was thunder, but as it grew louder, the truth became clear. Engines. Dozens of them. The Germans were mobilizing again. Rawlins lowered the binoculars. "They're regrouping faster than I thought." Tex swore under his breath. "We can't outrun them, sir. We're sitting ducks up here." "Not yet," Rawlins said, thinking quickly. "If we can make it to that ravine to the west, we can lose them in the trees." The Sherman lurched forward again, crawling along the ridge toward the distant tree line. The rumble of approaching engines grew louder by the minute. Morales switched between frequencies, catching brief bursts of German chatter, short, frantic transmissions about a missing convoy, sightings of a lone American tank, orders to destroy it at all costs. "Sir," Morales said, "they're talking about us. They know we're still out here." Rawlins nodded grimly. "Then we keep them guessing." As the Sherman descended into the ravine, the forest swallowed them again. The canopy overhead darkened the world to a dim twilight. They could hear the faint whistle of artillery being fired somewhere behind them, distant explosions echoing like thunderclaps. Tex spoke quietly. "You ever think about home, Lieutenant? About what comes after all this?" Rawlins hesitated. "Sometimes," he said. "But then I remember we've got to live through today before we can think about tomorrow." The words hung in the stale air, heavy with truth. For these men, survival wasn't about glory or medals, it was about holding on. Minute by minute, through the noise and the fire. They followed the ravine for miles until the sound of German pursuit faded into the distance. Night settled over the forest, cold and absolute. The Sherman finally rolled to a stop beside a shallow creek. The engine sputtered once, then went silent. Out of fuel at last. The men climbed out one by one, their boots sinking into the soft earth. They gathered by the side of the tank, their battered, bullet-pocked steel home, and stood quietly beneath the stars. The battle was over for now, but the war still stretched endlessly ahead. Rawlins rested a hand on the tank's hull. "You did good, girl," he murmured. "Better than anyone could have asked for." Daniels broke the silence. "So what now, sir?" Rawlins looked toward the horizon, where faint flashes of artillery lit the night sky. "Now," he said softly, "we wait. We wait for morning, and we see if we're still alive to fight it." The men nodded silently, each lost in thought. The forest around them was still, the only sound the gentle trickle of the creek. Above them the stars shimmered faintly through the drifting smoke. They had laughed at his crazy plan. They had called it impossible. But as the wreckage of 2 German convoys smoldered behind them, and the last of their fuel burned away, one truth was clear. Madness or not, it had worked, and in the war's endless chaos, that was the closest thing to a miracle they would ever know. The night stretched on endlessly, the forest cloaked in thick fog, and the smell of burned metal that lingered in the damp air. The crew huddled inside the Sherman, their nerves strung tight as violin strings. Every creak of the tank's hull, every rustle outside the turret made them flinch. They knew the Germans would come eventually. The silence before dawn was the kind that felt alive, watching, waiting. Rawlins sat in the commander's seat, eyes half open but mind fully alert. He could still hear the echoes of the previous day's fight, the shriek of shells, the roar of the cannon, the screams muffled by smoke. Victory had come at a cost, fuel gone, ammo spent, and their tank barely holding together. The crew was alive, but they were stranded deep in enemy territory. For most soldiers, that would have meant surrender or death. But Rawlins wasn't like most soldiers. When the first light of morning seeped through the trees, he climbed out of the turret and scanned the horizon. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no movement, just the whisper of the wind through blackened branches. Down in the valley below, he could see the burned-out husks of the German convoy they'd annihilated. Smoke still curled from the twisted frames of trucks and armored cars. The destruction was staggering. One tank, a single crew, had shattered an entire enemy column. Tex joined him on the hull, rubbing his hands together to fight the cold. "You think they're still down there?" "They're there," Rawlins said. "And they're angry." Tex gave a bitter laugh. "Hell, if I were them, I'd be furious too. One American tank wrecking that much metal. Makes them look bad." Rawlins nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the valley. "They'll send patrols soon. Maybe armor. We can't stay put." Back inside the Sherman, Morales tried the radio again. Static hissed endlessly, but no signal came through. "Still nothing, sir," he said. "We're on our own." Daniels, ever the quiet one, spoke from below. "Sir, we could try the creek. Follow it north. If it leads to a road, maybe we'll find friendly lines." "Maybe," Rawlins replied, his tone thoughtful. "But if we move in daylight, they'll see us. If we stay, they'll find us. Either way, it's a gamble." The crew fell silent. Every decision felt like a coin toss with their lives at stake. By mid-morning, they made their move. Rawlins decided to push north under the cover of the forest, using the ravine and creek bed to mask their path. The Sherman groaned as it started forward, its engine coughing to life with a sound that seemed too loud, too risky. But it moved. Slowly, steadily. The battered machine trundled through the mud, crushing branches beneath its treads. The journey was agonizing. Every few minutes they stopped to listen, ears straining for the sound of engines or footsteps. Occasionally they heard distant gunfire echoing through the hills. Sometimes it was close enough to make their hearts pound. By noon they reached a clearing. There on the opposite ridge, a German recon vehicle sat idling, its crew scanning the terrain through binoculars. "The Americans froze. Don't move," Rawlins whispered. "Engines off." Nobody breathed. The German soldier swept the area lazily, then paused. His binoculars lingered, right where the Sherman sat half-hidden among the trees. For a long moment time seemed to stop. Then a crow burst from the trees, flapping noisily through the air. The German lowered his binoculars, muttered something to his driver, and the vehicle rolled on. The crew exhaled as one. "That was too damn close," Morales said, wiping sweat from his brow. Rawlins nodded. "They're getting closer." "We have to move faster," but the Sherman was struggling. Its tread slipped in the mud, the engine sputtered from low fuel, and the weight of battle damage made every incline a challenge. They were running on willpower alone. Hours passed. By sunset they found shelter in a grove near a shallow stream. The men climbed out, stretching stiff limbs. Daniels checked the tracks for damage. Morales set up a small listening post with what remained of the radio gear, and Tex cleaned the .50 caliber machine gun. Muttering under his breath about their odds, Rawlins stood apart from the crew, staring into the distance. His eyes followed the smoke trails that still rose faintly from the valley, marking the graveyard of the German convoy. He thought about the men they'd killed, the chaos they'd caused. It wasn't pride he felt, just the cold, heavy realization that one insane act had changed everything. He'd been laughed at when he proposed the flanking charge, mocked for his reckless tactics. Even his own commander had called it suicidal. But now, as night fell once more over the Ardennes, those same tactics had turned the tide of an entire sector. Tex broke the silence. "Sir, if we make it back, what do you think they'll say about all this?" Rawlins didn't answer right away. "Doesn't matter what they say," he finally replied. "What matters is we did what we had to do. We stopped them." "That's enough," the others nodded quietly. They all knew the truth. History wouldn't remember their names. It would remember the battles, the divisions, the generals, but not the 5 men who risked everything on a wild plan that no one believed in. As the men settled in for another long night, the forest seemed to breathe with them. In the distance, Artillery flashed against the clouds, painting the sky in fleeting bursts of white. The war was still raging all around them, an unstoppable storm. But here, for a brief moment, they had carved out a pocket of survival, proof that courage, madness, and determination could still change the course of fate. Rawlins sat against the side of the tank, his helmet resting beside him. The steel was cold but familiar, a silent companion through every battle. He closed his eyes and listened to the soft murmur of the creek, the low crackle of their fire, and the steady breathing of his crew. Tomorrow the fight would come again. The Germans would regroup, the front would shift, the war machine would grind on. But for now, in the shadows of a ruined forest, a single Sherman crew, mocked, doubted, and nearly destroyed, had done the impossible. They had survived. They had fought back. And they had turned the enemy's laughter into silence. When dawn finally broke, it came quietly, muted rays of sunlight filtering through the fog, turning the charred remains of the forest into ghostly silhouettes. The Sherman sat motionless, its hull streaked with mud, ash, and soot. Its once proud olive-drab paint was now scorched and pitted from shrapnel. Inside, the men stirred slowly, their faces hollow from exhaustion but alive. The radio crackled faintly, just static at first, then like a whisper from another world, the distant voice of an American unit. Morales froze, his eyes wide. "Sir, it's them." "It's our boys." Rawlins was beside him in an instant. "Say again, Morales. Get me that signal." He adjusted the dials with trembling hands, fine-tuning the frequency until the voice came through clearer. "This is Able Company to any friendly armor in Sector 4. Identify yourself." Rawlins grabbed the headset. "Able, this is Sherman Tank Dixie. We're alive and rolling. Coordinates." He looked to Morales, who quickly read off their position. There was a pause, then the sound of pure disbelief from the other end. "Jesus, you're supposed to be dead. Command wrote you off yesterday." Rawlins managed a weary grin. "Not dead yet, son. We've still got some fight left." Within an hour, the rumble of engines echoed through the trees. American armor appeared on the ridge, Shermans, half-tracks, and jeeps marked with the white star. Relief washed over the crew like rain after a drought. As the rescue column rolled in, men climbed out of their vehicles, staring at Dixie in awe. The tank was a wreck, patched with bullet holes dented from near misses, its treads caked with blackened mud, but it stood there defiantly, smoke curling lazily from its exhaust. A young lieutenant approached, eyes wide. "You the crew that tore up that convoy down in the valley?" Rawlins nodded. "That'd be us." The officer shook his head, half laughing. "You're out of your minds. Command says you stopped the entire flank. Those Krauts were supposed to cut through and surround the regiment. Instead, they're scrap metal." Tex smirked from the turret. "Guess that crazy plan wasn't so crazy after all." They were escorted back to the main line later that day. As Dixie rolled through the muddy roads toward the American camp, soldiers stopped and stared. Some saluted, others cheered. The battered tank had become a legend overnight, a story whispered across the front lines. The tale of the Sherman that refused to die. In the debrief tent, Rawlins was summoned to report to his commanding officer, Colonel Wexler. The colonel was an old soldier, broad-shouldered, hard-eyed, the kind of man who measured respect not by words but by deeds. When Rawlins entered, he snapped to attention, helmet tucked under his arm. Wexler looked up from a stack of reports. "Lieutenant Rawlins," he said slowly, "you disobeyed a direct retreat order." "Yes, sir," Rawlins replied evenly. "You led your crew into a German kill zone." "Yes, sir." "You risked an entire tank and crew without authorization." Rawlins nodded. "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying him. "And in doing so, you destroyed half a German armored column, delayed their counterattack by a full day, and saved the left flank of the 3rd Armored Division." Rawlins didn't move. Wexler stood, walking around the desk until he was face to face with him. Then slowly he extended his hand. "Hell of a job, Lieutenant." Rawlins blinked, unsure for a moment how to react, then shook the colonel's hand firmly. Outside, as he rejoined his crew, the camp buzzed with stories. Men approached to shake their hands, to slap them on the back, to ask how they'd done it. Morales grinned, Tex cracked jokes, and Daniels quietly smiled, the first time he'd done so in days. They were heroes now, though none of them had set out to be. That night the crew sat by a small fire beside their Sherman. The tank loomed above them, a silent monument to everything they had endured. Flames flickered across its dented armor, dancing over the white stars faded by battle. Tex took a long breath. "You think they'll ever believe it, sir? One tank against all that?" Rawlins chuckled softly. "They'll believe it. Maybe not how it happened, maybe not all of it. But they'll believe something extraordinary happened here," Morales added. "They'll probably make it sound cleaner, like it was part of the plan all along." Rawlins looked up at the tank, the reflection of the fire in his tired eyes. "War's never clean, Morales. It's chaos, and sometimes chaos needs someone crazy enough to step into it." The others fell quiet. Above them, the stars shimmered faintly through drifting smoke. For a few moments there was peace, the kind that only comes after surviving the impossible. In the days that followed, Rawlins and his men were reassigned to another sector. Their Sherman was repaired, patched, refueled, repainted. On the side of its turret, someone stenciled new words in white paint. "Crazy Dixie." The name stuck. When they rolled out again, heading toward the next battle, the crew didn't speak much. There was nothing to say. They all knew what lay ahead. More smoke, more fire, more chances to defy death. But as the engine roared and the tank lurched forward, Rawlins glanced at the horizon and thought of how far they'd come. Somewhere out there, German officers still whispered about the lone Sherman that struck from the fog, that turned their armored might to ashes. To them it was a ghost story, a cautionary tale of American recklessness. But to Rawlins and his men, it was proof of something greater, that courage wasn't about following orders or sticking to logic. Sometimes it was about believing in a crazy plan when no one else did. As Crazy Dixie disappeared down the road, its tracks cutting deep into the French soil, the echoes of that madness lingered, a reminder that in the fires of war, it's not always the biggest gun or the strongest armor that wins. Sometimes it's the sheer unbreakable will of a handful of men who refuse to back down. And long after the smoke cleared, that story of a crazy tank commander and his crew would live on as one of those legends of World War II that proved one simple truth. Bravery, in its purest form, often looks a lot like madness.